week of our podcast on Red Dead Redemption 2 history and ethics and ethical theory. So this week, what we're reading chapters 9 and 10 in the Russ Schaefer Landau text, The Fundamentals of Ethics. Chapter 9 is on the attractions and strengths of consequentialism. The focus there is primarily act utilitarianism, although there is a brief discussion of rule utilitarianism in these chapters as well. And chapter 10 is really focused on the objections, problems, and issues that are common to consequentialism, again, by focusing mostly on utilitarianism, since it is by far the most popular, most widespread version of this broad ethical theory. We're also reading Heather Cox Richardson's Western Mathematics. Please read chapter 4. That's 121 to 147. And then for graduate students or ambitious undergraduates or people that are just interested, we have Greg Grandin's The End of the Myth, the piece by Robert Gooden's Utility and the Good, and then Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So that's what we're going to be talking about this week.
All right. And so for chapter 4, Richardson, you have this moment as the 1872 election comes into view, and you have the rise of what's called the Liberal Republican Party, which is a really sort of fascinating kind of lesser known moment in U.S. history, just because it's kind of a flash in the pan, but it gives you a decent glimpse of this, what Richardson calls the emerging mainstream, right, ideology. And what the Liberal Republican Party is looking to do is reverse government growth, right, and sort of seeking a middle view. And this is obviously growth that's come out of the Civil War, expansion of government, and then you have the Reconstruction, which is rebuilding the South, occupying the South, so on and so forth. So it's basically this political party arises out of this tension. What they do is they bring together sort of the Northern free labor idea with the Southern emphasis on small government, right? So free labor, small government, and the idea that you would push back against special interests, right? And so special interests, as we know from previous chapters, was, included everyone from workers to big business to newly emancipated African Americans. And the idea here is, the middle class view of, well, everyone just needs to work hard and not have special a special sort of favoritism from the government. The other part too is it's the idea of subsidizing business, giving business free land. All of this is making Americans nervous, and again, it's kind of this strange view before we move into the 20th century, where there's sort of a less of an anti-corporate sentiment, at least in the early decades of the 20th century. One person that fits the image of this moment is Andrew Carnegie, right? I just saw was it Leviticus Cornwall? I literally just saw him last night playing when he confronted myself and Dutch, or Arthur and Dutch, who were in that little saloon, and I had to go out, and then I just shoot my way out of Valentine. But Andrew Carnegie is, one of the people that Leviticus is modeled after, and he's also, right, this personifies, growing big business, but then you're also kind of buying up businesses around you, right? So there's this, if you're in business school, there's the vertical and horizontal expansion. So you're either going to expand and buy all your competitors, or you're going to buy up everything from the mine all the way to the stores that sell, say, a product that's made of steel. Um, and then this is also the rise of the corporation and in the more modern sense that we know today. And because of the needs of corporations, especially as there's no longer a regional, more of a national sense. There needs to be more money. They need larger pools of capital. And so again, this is all sort of coming together as, literally big business, but um, the federal government's also intervening to a greater extent as well.
Yeah, Dan, I just wanted to say this. I thought, I remember thinking this the first time that we did this and I read this book. But it just, it's reminded, I was reminded again of just how interesting this was. Not being a historian, I don't always have a sense of, these institutions that seem like they've been with us for a long time. Many of them, I understand that they're very new. I understand that, corporations as they exist now are pretty new, but it was not something I'd really thought a lot about. And so this section really learning about sort of the change in how corporations used to function and how they now function and how that really is a result of this. I just thought that was really, really interesting and one of my favorite parts of this book. So it's a good example of how learning history of what kind of happened before can be really insightful into whether the kind of structures that we have around us that maybe seem so forbidding and immutable are actually relatively recent in the scheme of things and might be different again at some future point. So
Yeah, and especially, I mean, the corporation, in our era, meaning, the 20th century going into the 21st century, there's sort of a naturalness to the corporation, right? And we're still dealing with that 14th Amendment, right?
yeah,
With uh,
absolutely.
personhood, right? A few years ago, there was the Supreme Court decision that reaffirmed personhood upon corporation. So all of this is an ongoing, centuries old conversation.
Yeah,
Um, but as a lot of these larger companies, and you have sort of the crew, Rockefeller and others alongside Carnegie. A lot of these businessmen come out of the Civil War, and they're able to basically get rich off contracts during the Civil War. But other people were getting rich as well, right? There you had shareholders. So there's all this money after the war, and this is where capital kind of gets directed into various operations. And one of these, one of them or a few of them is basically steel and railroads and stuff like that. But as you kind of figure out, steel inherently goes with the railroad, right? Like you can't have railroads without steel. The train itself, all that stuff. So there is this the more railroads you make, the more steel, the higher demand in steel. And for good or for bad, it definitely stimulates the American steel industry in the sense that by the 20th century it's pretty powerful. But during these early days you do have tariffs because British steel is just it's cheaper. They're a few decades ahead of the United States. So this is also that moment of tariffs, which again, for regular people, tariffs aren't necessarily a good thing. They're good if you own the business. They're not necessarily good if you're trying to buy steel. Um, the other part is, and this kind of goes towards the Republican Party, and you have this unraveling of scandals, right? And I think one of the things we should always remember, like there's no such thing as a government without scandal, right? I feel like anytime you have a large, sort of a state operation, and then you have private individuals, like there's always going to be like some kind of corruption.
yeah,
Um,
some room for graft or
yeah. It's just too there's no way to have it completely in check. But this one, basically there was a scandal. Two wealthy people, one guy shoots the other, the one dies, but then in the wake of this murder, this scandal arises, and it's the Erie Canal, the Erie Ring business venture, right? And so, fraud, all this stuff's tied back to, I think, Republican Party, and so they're kind of in damage control. But what comes out of this is this liberal Republican campaign, right? So it's not the Republican Party that would elect Grant. It's this newer Republican campaign, and it's significant that it's not the Democrats, it's this new party that is challenging Grant. Um, Although there are many Democrats that are a part of this liberal Republican party. This
I,
is also for your Mark Twain, right? The Gilded Age, written by Charles Twain and then Charles Dudley Warner. But this kind of is the heart of this moment, right, in the early 1800s or 1870s.
yeah, I really, this is another thing I remember enjoying both this time around and the first time that I read the book. And this is an earlier chapter, although I mean it's spread out in this chapter as well. And as you note, the focus on not only sort of like this sort of business corruption, but also the government corruption, and particularly the idea that what how do you get people to vote? Well, you just give them the straight ticket and probably some alcohol or something, right? And you
Mhm.
basically just sort of purchase their vote even when they don't really know what they're doing. um, and not to mention these sort of ward bosses that control huge swaths of political power, and like anyone else that controls big swaths of political power, or any other kind of power, really often works to increase that power and utilize it. And so it's it is not a surprise in a certain way that you had this kind of quasi reformist thing really coming up and being influential at this time because of people being sick of, right, these different kinds of both business and political corruption.
Yeah, I always think of during this era. I keep thinking of Gangs in New York, that movie, right,
Yeah,
where it's literally Tammany and what is it? Butcher Bill is working for Tammany to help get the
yeah, that's
votes.
right.
It's definitely a fun depiction of the time here.
Yeah,
Uh,
I was so this is a little off topic, but thinking about Gangs of New York always makes me think about Daniel Day-Lewis, who is just an incredible character actor. His turn in There Will Be Blood is probably like one of my favorite cinematic performances ever. Anyway, I was just listening to podcasts where they were talking about Pulp Fiction, and apparently in an early, kind of script or casting list for Pulp Fiction, I think that there was, I think Quentin Tarantino wanted Daniel Day-Lewis maybe to play Vincent Vega, right, who is
oh,
opposite of Jules, and that would have been absolutely wild. Like what his method acting even would have been like there. But sorry, that's just a fun digression. Please continue.
yeah. Well, to take that digression into There Will Be Blood, for those that is on the unofficial film list for the class,
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
because I mean it's less than a decade out from the game, and perhaps
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
it's right in the middle of the first game, I believe. So if you haven't seen There Will Be Blood, uh, that's fantastic. Yeah, it's a fantastic period piece. Um, so right I'm going to read this line, or it's a paragraph, I guess, from Richardson. Um, but it's sort of it's good enough to sort of quote in the whole. Um, but what happens? Obviously, liberal Republicans lose to Grant in '72. But it's like Goldwater losing the short game but winning the long game, right? Goldwater loses in 1964, but his thoughts become the mainstream by the 70s, right? And we live in Goldwater's shadow, really more so than we live in Kennedy's shadow, right? During that, or even Johnson's shadow. Anyway, so Richardson writes, liberal Republican platform defined a new alliance in American politics for the rest of the century and began the reconciliation of North and South around the idea of individualism. In this increasingly mainstream vision, individual men could rise on their own so long as government refused to pander to the interests of industrialists or disaffected workers. Critically, this new vision did not include activist women, but rather placed women firmly in the home of an individualistic man. Domestic imagery and anti abortion agitation reinforced its domestic ideals. Together, the men and women who embraced this worldview made up a new middle class, distinguished not by their income, but by their determination to hold what they believed was an even handed government, steady from the demands of those at the top as well as those at the bottom of society. Right. And so,
You know, yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
oh,
please.
no, go ahead.
If I think, I guess I would say like maybe if you're thinking of something specific, maybe finish it because I was just thinking this is a really good kind of way to get into utilitarianism and consequentialism a little bit. So, um, so I think in particular, right, this quote about the reconciling the North and the South around the idea of individualism. Consequentialism in a certain way, and especially the form of it that is focused on utilitarianism, in a certain way, it is very kind of anti-individualistic. And so this is maybe a way to get into it. Of course, clearly, everyone involved here is worried about these things like public corruption and the kind of net effects, the consequences of these businesses, right? So when we have, for example, the Erie Ring business venture, right, and the sort of failure of that. Well, what are people worried about? They're worried about the consequences. And so I think this is a good way to kind of think about this ethical theory, consequentialism. So if you recall from last week for Kant, one of the things we spent some time talking about is that for Kant, our focus is really, does my rule, my maxim for myself, does it sort of, it tells me what action to take, right? And one of the things about Kant that we, I think, briefly talked about, but didn't really go into a lot is, Kantian theory is very often contrasted with utilitarianism and consequentialism because on a Kantian view, the focus is really, did I do the right thing sort of for the right reason? Right? Did I have the right intention? Did I follow the right rule? Am I treating a person as an end, right, rather than a means? But for Kant, the focus is less on consequences and more on, as you noted in the reading, sort of was the right thing achieved? Was justice served? Was morality done? Right? Did I do the right thing with my goodwill, with making my maxim, with talking into and dealing with, and my actions affecting other people? And so for Kant, like if you think about an example that kind of distinguishes maybe consequentialism and Kantianism, if you had a consequentialist, if a person, let's say, tries to, I don't know, harm another person, but fails just because, I'd say the gun jams or something like that. Well, I mean, what Kant is going to point out is the intention was still there. They were trying to bring about this harm, this sort of evil action, even though they didn't succeed. Well, the fact that their consequences didn't sort of work out the way they wanted to is almost irrelevant, he thinks, of our moral evaluation of that person. On a consequentialist view, it's sort of the exact opposite. I do care about people's intentions, right? I mean, any ethical theory, I mean, Kant is the same way. It's not that Kant has no time in his ethical theory for consequences at all. It's just that they're not prioritized, right? When you have all of these things come together of my character and my intentions, what is my sort of socio-political kind of status, and what are the consequences of my actions? In all ethical theories have to say something about all of those things. But what often happens is different theories will say some of them are more fundamental or more important, or when you have a kind of a conflict that one sort of overrides the other, right? And so for Kant, it's really, did I follow the right rule? Am I doing the right thing, right, with the sort of right kind of intention? Is my act just, right? Or is my act the good thing to do? Is it morally permissible or morally obligatory? Am I fulfilling an obligation? Am I doing my duty, essentially, right? And you can do your duty even though the consequences might not be the best thing in the world, if it's your duty, maybe you kind of got to do it. And maybe your duty is something that won't ultimately change something, but that doesn't really, give you any cover, right? Consequentialism, the theory we're thinking about and talking about this week, is really focused on those consequences. Um, when I do something, of course, I want to bring about consequences. So I have intentions and I have beliefs about things, and I might act regularly in certain ways, thinking about, say, the virtue ethics, which we'll come to, and my decision making might rely on, and people's various demographic categories we think about, like race or gender, that might deeply affect, right, decisions that I make. But for consequentialism, the focus, like many of us think is really intuitive, is like what's actually going to happen on the ground, right? What are the consequences of my action? um, and that is the main focus. So in the case where the person, right, fires the gun, but the gun jams, they didn't kill somebody, the consequentialists might say, look, you shouldn't have done that. What you did was wrong because you were trying to bring about these negative consequences. But look, we got to kind of look at the facts on the ground. What happened? And in this case, the consequence was no one was killed, right? And so that's the thing we really want to make a judgment about. As Schaefer Landau notes, it's obviously a little more complicated. It's not like utilitarians don't think you should do any planning or any intending. And, we don't always know how our actions, what they're going to lead to. But when I'm both making my own decisions and evaluating things, what I really look at fundamentally is the consequences. And that is the most intuitive thing about utilitarianism and consequentialism is, you know, when I'm thinking about how I should morally evaluate a situation, there's this old saying, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And certainly what that means is like I can have all the intentions I want, but what's actually going to come about, right? What's actually going to happen. And that's a really intuitive part of consequentialism is like my focus is on what actually is happening with people, right? What are the end results of this big plan, right? And the reason that I wanted to bring this in and think about this in relation to individualism in this bit of our history text is because the form of consequentialism most of us know the most about and is still one of the most widely developed and held contemporary ethical theories today is utilitarianism. And Gooden gives a good kind of breakdown linking utilitarianism to our stuff from the first part of the course on like the source of the good life, the nature of the good life. So if you recall, he went over hedonism, he goes over preferentialism or desire satisfaction theory. He adds welfarist considerations, that is, not like the political concept of welfare, but the idea that you have interests and your interests can be served, and those interests are not reducible just to pain and pleasure, nor are they reducible just to what fulfills your preferences, right? And that does move it a little closer to kind of an an objective list theory, kind of like we got. But the basic idea behind utilitarianism is what do I need to do? What ought I do? What ought governments and nations and corporations to do? Well, on a utilitarian view, you ought to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And historically, utilitarianism mostly is hedonistic. It says, look, here's one thing we can all agree on. Having pleasure is good, and being in pain kind of sucks, right? And so when people are suffering and are harmed, that counts in our moral calculus. And when we do things that serve people's, reduces their suffering, increases their pleasure, those are good things, right? And that also relates to our moral calculus. The reason I want to say that this, oh yeah, go ahead.
So when we think about, so consequentialism and then utilitarianism, how do
Yeah.
we make sense of the hierarchy of that? Like,
So you
con-
should think about it like it's like squares and rectangles, right? Every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square.
Mhm.
Every form of utilitarianism is consequentialist, but you could, in principle, be a consequentialist without being a utilitarian. It's just like the most well-known and well-worked-out theory, which is why Schaefer Landau focuses on it. And really, you could go to like just about any other intro ethics text, even if they don't talk about consequentialism per se. You're going to have a chapter on utilitarianism because it is just the most the one that the most ink has been spilled on, the one that people still talk about today, et cetera. So it's the most well-known and well-worked out form of consequentialism, which is why
Yeah.
people kind of contrast it with these other things. But in principle, and there are a handful of people who have worked out different kinds of consequentialist ethics that are not strictly utilitarian.
Okay, so it's consequentialism is the umbrella, and then
Exactly.
utilitarianism is a version of that kind of falls under this umbrella.
Exactly. Yeah. The reason that Schaefer Landau focuses on it, and kind of the same reason that I'm, kind of focused on it, is just it's I mean, it's not exactly the only game in town, but it is the most it's the one that like is has sort of garnered the most scholarly attention and has been the most influential. And so, it is not true to say consequentialism is identical to utilitarianism, but
Mhm.
for our purposes, when we're thinking about it, we're mostly going to be focusing on utilitarianism just because it is the sort of best kind of exemplar theory of the broader view of consequentialism. So um, the thing that I think is I think there's a lot to say about utilitarianism. We could talk about sort of the people who founded it. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are the founders of utilitarianism, and of course, you read the Peter Singer piece. Um, but I don't want to do that. I want to maybe save some of that until kind of the end here. I just wanted to say one other thing. Right, consequentialism is very intuitive. Utilitarianism, right, the greatest good for the greatest number. Part of why I think that's cuts against individualism is in a certain way, and this is maybe confusing individualism and egoism. So just I guess bear with me. If I'm really looking out for me and what I want and what is the good for me, well, then I might do it in a way that I don't really care about how my actions affect others, right? Or maybe I only care about how my actions affect the people that I care about, right? My family or friends. And so, just like impartiality was supposed to be a real benefit of Kantian ethics, it's also supposed to be a real benefit of consequentialism, right? So, if I'm going to make a decision, um, if I'm going to make a decision about aligning myself with the new liberal Republicans because I don't want people from the top or bottom kind of strong arming the government or whatever, well, part of what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out like who does this affect and how can I kind of guide it, right? And it might be the case that part of what is morally objectionable about this sort of new middle class ideology is that it's basically sort of not taking seriously the needs of some of the people that are affected, right? And that is something that on a consequentialist view and a utilitarian view, you're just not really supposed to do. I'm not if my actions at the top, right? If I make a policy or if I, you know, swindle a bunch of money from a bunch of people or funnel a bunch of money out of a government thing for my own benefit. Well, if that affects lots of other people, I shouldn't do that, right? Or at least unless there's a really good reason to, unless it serves their benefit too, I'm not supposed to do that. There's a lot more to say here, but I guess I just want to stop and let us continue talking about the history, and we'll kind of come back to some of the problems with utilitarianism. But it's really focused on sort of this kind of, in a certain way, collective approach, which is whether I'm an individual person or whether I'm really poor or I'm a millionaire, whether I'm in charge of a government, like thinking about social policy, whether I'm a corporation thinking about what product am I going to roll out or how am I going to interact with these people or how am I going to extract this resource or whatever. The key sort of watch phrase for utilitarians is I need to do and I'm required to do what it will have the greatest effect to bring about the greatest good on the greatest number of people. And Schaefer-Lando talks about some sort of complexities in that, as does Gooden, but that's sort of the basic, I think, idea that we want to leave you with. So,
Yeah, so for the graduate readings, um, I think it's probably week 2 of Grandin. And so I was just going to go through the the bit on Frederick Jackson Turner, and he delivers this speech in 1893 um, called "The Significance of the Frontier in American History" in Chicago during the I think it's the World's Fair. Right. So another interesting part of the World's Fair is right next to it. You had Buffalo Bill and his Wild West show, which I believe this is another book. If not, you should add it to your list. Buffalo Bill's America, William Cody and the Wild West Show by Lewis S. Warren. Um, I mean, it's hard to talk about Red Dead uh, or the West in general without talking about Buffalo Bill as he he personifies, like, I mean, he obviously was running around the West, right? Quote, the West, but he's also quick to shape an image of the West through himself, where most of the stuff he says was just made up. Where, he talks about, like, I mean, there's a whole list of things that, um, and so it's more of him as this force of nature, right? He becomes the West, and that's what that show is. But so for Frederick Jackson Turner, though, a part of his argument was the idea that American democracy comes out of, quote, settlers transforming frontier wilderness into free land, right? And because that happens over and over and over again, that is sort of the regenerating cycle that makes American democracy, right? And the alarm is sounded when the 1890 census basically says the frontier is closed. Because with the closing of the frontier, that means that suddenly there isn't this place that anyone can go and be ruggedly individual and make something of the West, right? And that, psychologically, that hits the country pretty hard. Within the game, especially that, towards the end of chapter 2, you really do get this sense of panic. Especially after the Valentine, where you shoot up the town and you get back to camp and Hosea is arguing with Dutch, we're just a bunch of killers, and Dutch is trying to keep this idealistic dream alive. And even that's the great dialogue between Arthur and Charles on the way to find a new camp. There is this doom, right? This sense of massive change and the inability to keep up with it.
Yeah, it's
And
frantic. Feels very frantic.
yeah, and so this is the version of that. The less exciting version of that is Frederick Jackson Turner's speech at the American Historical Association, right, conference. It's just a conference paper, but it's more than that, right? Um, and the idea that frontier, this is Grandin writing, frontier individualism, Turner said, didn't just exist on the frontier. It was found everywhere in the country, in its cities, villages, and ports, because of the existence of the frontier. That is, because individualism was generated on the frontier, and because the frontier kept a check on other, less wholesome tendencies, including demands for wealth redistribution. Right. And then that element goes back to that, right, that liberal Republican middle class, right, mainstream view of, special interests, either from the top or the bottom, trying to gain control over, right, this large government that has, possession of extensive wealth, especially in terms of land out west. The other parts of this too, right, where Grandin continues, that premise makes possible the ongoing refusal, right? And this is in today's sense, right? So, the reason why we still talk about Turner is so much of what he wrote. It's not that it was historically accurate in the sense of how everything worked and the way he framed it, but it's almost as if the cultural assumptions he brings to the table in coming up with his thesis continue, right, to influence the way we think about things. And this goes to, right, this, as Grandin writes, the ongoing refusal of the United States to accept the legitimacy of social or economic rights, individual or inherent rights found in nature, to have, to bear, to move, to assemble, to believe, to possess, were legitimate, as was a state that protected them. But social rights, right, to receive health care, education, welfare, made possible by state intervention, were perverse, right? And so both, Turner, but that also goes back to that 1872 liberal Republican sort of party platform that's critical of all this. And the other
But
two thing
this
too
also
is
kind of connects, just thinking back to our early readings, the readings about rights-based theories, if you recall,
yes,
this connects to the idea of like sort of positive and negative rights, right? And also just rights that are about sort of like my immediate action or my acquisition or sort of my power versus maybe a right I have to, as he says, receive a certain kind of thing or something, right? And so sometimes people will describe those as, positive rights and negative rights versus like liberty rights and power rights or other things. So I just wanted to note that and make that connection there from what Grandin is talking about to also the stuff that we read in the second week of class earlier on in our reading for our podcast.
yeah, and I think those sort of the good and the bad rights. For Turner, right, he's critical of monopolies, and again, I think between our own time and Turner's time or Red Dead time, right, like that's probably one of the biggest changes, right, over the last century is kind of throwing our hands in the air regarding monopolies, or more accurately, oligopolies, right? Like, companies that kind of control most of the market, right?
Yeah.
For Turner and that liberal Republican, and then you could even bring in, we're not really there yet, but the populists, especially the populists, there, monopoly capitalism is not necessarily that's the enemy of sort of the everyman, the common person, trying to earn a living or opening a store or farming or something like that. Um, but when you think about this, how might this, when we, like the utilitarianism, I'm still curious about, right? The idea of like, was justice served, you know, um,
Yeah.
is, it's, if something happens, but it's not intentional, or if something doesn't happen, but it was intentional to happen,
Yeah.
you know, because a lot of this stuff is contingent, right? Like,
Yes.
especially as we get into the 1870s and 1880s, no one knows, nothing's written out. It's no one
Yeah.
knows the direction.
Yeah. What it
Uh,
will lead to, or yeah.
yeah, I guess that the 14th Amendment is a good, the
Oh,
14th
great
Amendment is
example.
created to protect the rights of African Americans, but it's vastly utilized by sort of this growing expansion of corporate America. And now it's sort of it's the arguably it's the Achilles heel of today's decisions, Supreme Court decisions about
Yeah.
um, the validity of certain laws.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting example and thing to think about. A thing that is true in utilitarianism, and I think, in many cases about our moral reasoning is, just as human beings individually, but also even, thinking socially or collectively, we just have to operate with, under a kind of like uncertainty. We just don't always know what our actions will bring about. We if we can reliably predict what is likely to happen, on a kind of utilitarian view, we can't ignore that information. We can't be like, well, I'm gonna do this thing that I know has like a really high chance of causing all these people harm, but you never know how it'll turn out, right? It could be the 10% or whatever. Like, you're really not supposed to do that, but they also want to acknowledge like we kind of plan as best we can, and that's all we can really do. And so utilitarians will sometimes say there's a difference between evaluating the person's sort of action and their, say, moral blameworthiness versus the evaluation of the situation. So, was a person blameworthy for doing a thing that they maybe could not have reasonably predicted would have resulted in all this bad stuff happening? Probably not, but we can still look at the thing that happened and say this was really a bad thing to have happened or something. So that is, I think, really interesting in thinking about how all of these sort of historical contingencies and then leading to where we are. I think also, the other thing I guess I think to think about here that Well, I guess, one kind of random thought and another, and just really thinking about what you were saying about justice. So we'll do the random thing first, then we'll do the justice thing. The thing about monopolies and sort of how that has changed and sort of populism too, it really reminds me, if any of our listeners are in Kansas, and Dan, this is also maybe directed at you too. I don't know if any of you listeners, or Dan, you have gone to the Garden of Eden in Lucas. Lucas, Kansas is not too far away from here. The Garden of Eden is it's this basically house, but also a bunch of sculptures by this guy named S.P. Dinsmore, who was a Civil War veteran. But then, I mean, I don't even want to spoil it. I don't even know what to say. Like, he created these big sort of, he's kind of a folk artist or an outsider artist. So he didn't have a lot of training, but he made these huge concrete sculptures in his yard. And one of them is this sort of big octopus that the common man is fighting, and one of the tentacles is like monopolies, right? And so, he was a super weird guy and had a bunch of weird beliefs, and like his body is still entombed there in concrete. You can actually go see it. He was a super weirdo, so it's totally worth your time. Go visit in Lucas, Kansas, tiny little art town, super super interesting. But that's what I was thinking about, is he had all of these, like, this big octopus, right, has all these tentacles. And I remember distinctly, like, one of them being monopolies, and how much he, as this kind of, artist and quasi philosopher, was like, he would hold these sermons and preach to people, and he just like was super against monopolies, among other things. And it's just so interesting to see how that has just changed over time, right? So number one, that's just a cool thing to see. If you're in Kansas, check out the Garden of Eden in Lucas, Kansas. And two, it just shows how much has changed about, some of our attitudes about some of that stuff. So I want to get back, though, to the point you made about justice. That is really, I really want to talk about two things here that are kind of what you might consider kind of Achilles heels, or at least the glaring problems with utilitarianism. One is that utilitarianism, at least act utilitarianism, or this kind of consequentialism, just kind of has a problem with justice. And the reason, I think, should be pretty clear. If we go back to think about what we were talking about with rights in the second week of the class, one of the things that rights are supposed to do is they're kind of acting as a kind of limit, right? So suppose I do want to bring about a great public good, but I have to do some really, really terrible stuff to, I don't know, 5 people to do it. If what I'm doing really violates the fundamental rights of those people, then even if it could benefit all these people, maybe I shouldn't do it, right? On a consequentialist view, I'm doing whatever is best for people, for everyone, even if a few people kind of, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet kind of thing, right? If I have to violate some people's rights or treat them really poorly, that's justified as long as it's sort of optimific. It creates the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And justice is really, I mean, in a certain way, one way to think about justice is as fairness, or as receiving what is due to you, or as not, being treated a certain way if the basis of that treatment is a morally irrelevant difference. Um, you know, One way to think about justice is fairness, right? It's not fair, it's unjust in a certain way. And on a utilitarian view, the question is almost like, well, does justice fit with what is doing the best for the greatest number of individuals involved? If so, good, we'll want to keep it. And if not, well, sometimes you got to violate a little justice. You got to violate people's rights. You got to do something unjust to create, what is the best for everyone involved. So thinking about kind of a literature connection, if you've ever read the short story, The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas, it's a Ursula Le Guin short story. It's really, really powerful. It's pretty short too, and you can find it online really easily. But this whole city is just like the best city you could imagine, and everyone in it is happy, and there's no unemployment, and there's no, people have holidays, and like everyone feels fulfilled. But in one house, in one basement, there's this child, and it's not ever explained the mechanism, right? It's just everyone kind of knows in Omelas that this person is basically sacrificed to make the entire thing work, right? And the point of the story is some people just can't accept that as a deal, and so they walk away from Omelas, right? They think this city is great and it's wonderful and living here is so amazing, but it's sort of based on a bargain, right? And the bargain is this innocent individual will have to suffer in terrible, terrible ways to make it possible, right? And that's a kind of critique of a utilitarian viewpoint, right? And that is the biggest critique. Rural utilitarians can sometimes get around it, and people have tried, right? This is not a new thing, but so it's not like there are no attempted solutions. Obviously, this is a class where we're just introducing and talking about the main things of these ethical theories. If you wanted to dive deeper into them, there's a lot more to say back and forth, right? But it is one of the biggest problems for utilitarianism. The other thing I think to note and to think about is, and this really links to our article by Peter Singer, which is that utilitarians just have a hard time with if what you are required and obligated to do is to serve the greatest good for the greatest number of people, then a lot of actions we usually think of as super erogatory, going back to the language we had in that first moral primer article in the class. You remember, just as a reminder, morally supererogatory things are things that are good to do. They're laudable. We say of someone that did them, oh my God, that's amazing. You did such a good thing. But we don't think people are required to do them, right? And so the example of a person jumping on a grenade to save other people, we think that is amazing and heroic and selfless, and they should be honored. But we don't think that all the people that didn't do it thereby did something bad, right? And people often think that with charity. And the Singer article, which is written after a famine in, I think, Bengal, um, is him basically saying a lot of us think that works this way. That if we are affluent people in developed nations, that it sure would be nice if we gave some of our wealth to help a famine in Bengal, or distribute and purchase mosquito nets for people where malaria, or areas where malaria is a real problem, right? And he gives an argument. You'll notice when you read it, he actually does not appeal explicitly to any deeply utilitarian principles. But utilitarianism, he's a utilitarian. He's not never made a secret of it. It's at work, and it's kind of at work in the argument too, even though you don't, it's not overt. But basically, he says, if you think like distance shouldn't matter, and those things are morally irrelevant, then the $20 you spend at Starbucks every week or whatever could be going to someone where it would literally save their life. And then you have to weigh, is it, would it be better overall for me to lose out on this small pleasure for someone else to receive like life-sustaining aid to reduce their suffering and make sure they can't get a disease? And he thinks the answer is pretty obvious. He thinks yes. So what he's doing there is really challenging the idea that charity is like super erogatory. He's saying it's actually an obligation for many of us. Again, if you're a person that lives in a developed country, if you're a person that, even let's say makes a middle class, as we think economically, income, maybe even a little lower than that, he thinks, well, look, it's not like you can't have any luxuries, but when we're balancing things out, what is the thing I ought to do? Should I send some of my money to people where it might literally save their lives, right? Where I might be able to provide food in a famine, and that is a kind of suffering, right? That most of us probably don't really know anything about. And what do I have to do? Well, maybe I have to not get, I don't know, this new DLC for my Red Dead Redemption game, or right, maybe I just don't have, maybe I don't eat out for a couple weeks or whatever, right? Those are really kind of luxuries that we take to like enjoy ourselves. But on his view, but you could use that same money and direct it in a way that it would provide resources for people who are, you know, literally dying on the edge of death, or could get like a really awful disease. And like, he thinks that it's not just like a nice thing, but well, you don't have to. He thinks, no, we have to. And when we don't, we're doing something wrong. And that really stems from his utilitarian kind of view. And so that's the other kind of challenge to utilitarianism. It's not that I'm not arguing that Singer is wrong about that. I'm just suggesting this is often difficult for people, right? I mean, some people will say utilitarianism really requires too much of human beings. It requires us to basically be moral saints, and nobody could realistically do that. And again, just as I said with the issue about justice, it's not like utilitarians don't know about this. There's a lot of ink spilled about, how you can do this in a way that, makes sense. And I mean, even Singer himself, he's really focused his recent work on kind of this idea of effective altruism, which is basically trying to get billionaires to funnel some of their money to really existentially existentially risky propositions in the future, right? And current things going on now. And when he's been challenged, for example, by Marxists about this, by people who say, "Look, why are we doing this? Why don't we just redistribute the wealth in general?" What he has said is, "Look, if I come in and I say this is what you have to do, and I say, and if you don't, we're just going to take it from you, that people are just going to stop listening to me. And if I say instead, look at all this good stuff you will do if you just channel some of your resources to this, he thinks it's more likely for people to actually do it. And so, again, part of this is practically thinking about what are the consequences of my action. So, again, he might be wrong about that, but it's an interesting thing to note about what he's doing is really thinking like what consequences are my actions going to have. Um, at the same time, right? You might ask, does Peter Singer live by this? He does give away large portions of his income, and when he has been awarded big prizes with monetary attachments, those, as far as I know, have basically gone to charities. He does note that he has spent a portion of his money helping his mother, who's dealing with, I think, Alzheimer's. And some people have said, well, couldn't you use that money to save like lots of other people? And he kind of says, yeah, but also I kind of do have some obligations to her. So it's a complex thing, and not without it being difficult for even for him. But if the question is, does Singer put his money where his mouth is? The answer is mostly yes. So I think this is just an interesting thing to think about when we think about the potential problems for utilitarianism. And then the only other thing I want to just say quickly, and I'm not going to spend much time on it because we don't want this to be too long, but I want to just bring back the idea of the scope of the moral community. That was a real concern we had about Kant, right? And in a certain way, the utilitarian approach does a better job with that because of its kind of hedonism focus, or at least taking seriously suffering of others. So when I make a choice about a policy or even my individual life, well, I can't just, it's not, my scope of moral community is not just reduced to people who are really, really smart or people who have this rational capacity or whatever. It's really any individual who can experience suffering and anything that has interests. And that's going to include, of course, that's going to include, fully functioning, typical, developed human beings. It's also going to include people with traumatic brain injuries, people maybe in comatose states. It's going to include people with severe developmental disabilities. And it's also going to include animals, right? And so that extends maybe the moral scope of the universe in a way that many people find much more palatable than something like Kant. So,
Yeah, I wonder if there's going to be an evolving as we go through the class and play the game.
yeah,
You know, it'd be interesting to see how the game steer you into one of these.
yeah,
Is how many times do you go? How many? Because like there's so many people. It's just like you can give them a buck.
yeah.
Like what? Just don't get that update on your scoped rifle.
That's
You can go
that's
without the
right.
update on the scoped rifle. You
That's
can
right.
always find ammunition. Just go find in a Driscoll camp.
Oh yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't even thought about that.
So, like how many, like I don't even buy ammo. I just ride around enough to get ambushed by O'Driscolls and then take their ammo.
Yeah,
And I try not to miss, so I save my ammo, but that
yeah.
allows me, I can pay off people if they need it.
Yeah, well, and I always think about, I always try to be a good I'm playing a little more of a mixed Arthur this time. But my inclination is to be good. And so every time I come back to the camp, I'm always like I'm trying to like I go hunting and donate food, and I donate like money, because I think like this is we're all in this together and this is my way of contributing or something, right? But yeah, I also am one of the people that like, yeah, I give the veteran $1 and I'll hug him or whatever, right? And like I do all of those things, and I want to help out random people in the wilderness, even though sometimes it's like a trap. I mean, it is, yeah, it's really interesting to think about how if you applied this in game, what it would look like. Now, the on the other hand, like it's pretty clear in game there are people who just are not in the scope of the moral community. Certainly the animals, right? You can, I mean,
Mhm.
I've slaughtered I don't know how many animals, right, just for my group, or to sell pelts, or to make myself a nice satchel or whatever. And probably the utility of that satchel is, I mean, again, it's in a game, but that animal living a good life probably worth more than my just because I have a sweet satchel or something, right? Um, and then the other thing I think is interesting to think about here is, you know, I found the first cabin. What is it? 6 Point cabin that you fight the first O'Driscoll camp at or whatever. And I figured out that, if you wait a while in game, you can go back and it repopulates them. You don't lose any honor shooting them or looting their bodies. And so I have regularly been going back there, both because it's a way to get some money up, right? You just, they all have silver pocket watches or platinum, engraved um, belt buckles or just change on them or whatever. But it also, as you said, they drop ammo and stuff, right? So I've been going back there and back there, and there's basically no penalty. It's like they're bad guys, open season, right? And so it's almost like in the game they don't count as members of the moral community, which is really an interesting kind of thing to think about. I really like that example, Dan, of yeah, just don't get the improved iron sights. You're going to use dead eye anyway, and just give that money to these people, especially for $1. What are you losing? So
Yeah. And it is funny too. It seems like you get weapons anyway. Like you don't really
yeah,
need to buy any weapons because usually they'll unlock for free.
yeah, many
Uh,
of them do. Yeah, I was just doing I just did a mission where I got the rolling block rifle, I think, right, which is kind of the sniper rifle. And um, yeah, I mean, you just sort of get ammo and you get guns. And so, and also, like, I'm one of those people that does all of the, I buy new outfits for Arthur, and I like, I want my weapons to like have different metals and be engraved and stuff. And it's like, that all costs a lot of money in game. Maybe I should just give that to the camp, right? Or I don't know. I mean, there are different ways to think about this, but yeah, playing in game I think is really interesting. So, well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we will look forward to talking with you next week. I've been Dr. Rob Byer with Dr. Dan McClure, and this is our podcast on Red Dead Redemption history and philosophy.
See you next week.
See you next week.